Before getting into the unofficial and informal assessment of GDPR, I wanted to look at the UK Data Protection Act because in some respect it's more modern than any US law on corporate surveillance. And Red Shell is private sector, as far as anybody knows. The Act is actually a little bit weak when it comes to regulation of the government, and it's been criticized for that, actually. So you could see it both ways. But it has 8 official principles, and there's a little bit of overlap between these. So personal data should be obtained and processed fairly and lawfully, number 1. Number 2, personal data shall be obtained only for one or more specified and lawful purposes. So 1 and 2 are closely related. You could say that 2 refers to the British tradition of requiring that search warrants be obtained to search for a specific thing. But really 1 and 2 concern mostly the same thing. You have to comply with the law. Which it is a little bit silly passing a law that says you must comply with the law. It's kind of redundant. But number 3, personal data shall be adequate, relevant, and not excessive. Principle 4, personal data shall be accurate and where necessary kept up to date. 5th, personal data should not be kept longer than necessary, which is an interesting provision in the sense that the U.S. doesn't have this. So a corporation or a government agency can keep your data forever, potentially, unless there's a contractual obligation for them not to. Then 6th principle, data must be processed according to the rights of the data subject. This is basically the same as 1. Again, it's a little bit redundant. The 7th principle, a data processor must ensure the security of data from unauthorized access. So in this case, the Red Shell scandal, probably this is not going to be violated because Red Shell are collecting information either for their own use or for the use of their clients. And they want it to be secret because obviously they want to have a competitive advantage over their competitors. Of course. The 8th principle, personal data cannot be transferred to a country outside the EU unless it has similar DPA laws. This is also called data localization. And Russia has a similar law that has actually cost data companies a considerable amount of money because they've had to obtain or rent server space in Russia so that they can store data on Russians, because both Russians actually and Russian residents are protected under the Russian data localization law, because the Russian data localization law requires that any data about them has to be stored in Russia so that it can be controlled by Russian authorities. Now, GDPR is the main law that came up in debate about Red Shell, because it came into effect almost at the same time that Red Shell was deployed in May of 2018. So the scandal basically erupted by the following month, basically between the last week of May, first week of June, from what I can tell. And you can go back to the Steam pages of Civilization 5 and 6 to look at this further, but it was roughly around that time. And it says GDPR is a European Union regulation, not a directive, because directives are actually advisory. They're not binding, whereas regulations are binding. Governing the handling of personal data of EU residents, even by companies located outside the EU. So this is why if you go on, say, the Washington Post website, they give you a blurb about cookies and so on. Terms of service for collection of data are mandated. Well, you could say that the users of Red Shell complied with this, except the consent was not opt-in, it was opt-out. A lot of people didn't even know about Red Shell because it wasn't specifically mentioned in the terms of service and the end-user license agreement. It says all consent must be opt-in, explicit, and informed. The Red Shell case didn't conform to any of these principles. Privacy must be by design as default. Again, it fails. In some situations, consent is not admissible, even if it is theoretically opt-in, explicit, and informed, particularly in situations where the data controller, this means the person who the data is on, may be under duress, as in an employment situation. That's another vocabulary thing if you're talking about GDPR or the Data Protection Act in the UK. The data controller is not actually the company, that's the user, because in theory they're the ones with the right to control their own information under GDPR. Another coercive aspect of Red Shell was that it was installed on people's computers not only without their opt-in consent, but also they were denied the right to use their already paid-for software without it. So, in a sense, if you wanted to maintain your privacy and the security of your computer, you had to give up your, 60, 70, 80 some odd euro purchase. So you could spend like a huge amount of money. It might be more or less, but it would be expensive. And then have a game that would be unusable. So in this sense, Red Shell was also coercive and probably in violation of GDPR, at least in spirit. Now, moving on to a few more principles of GDPR. Data controllers, again, to reiterate, these are the subjects of data collection, reserve the right to have their data deleted or corrected and have the right to data portability. And this includes the right to be forgotten. So if you're angry that Red Shell were collecting your data, in theory, they're required under GDPR to delete it when you demand that they do so. Data localization within EU jurisdiction is required. This is in line with UK law and Russian law, although not American law, interestingly enough. Maybe that should concern American voters. Data breaches must be reported within 72 hours of discovery. This mostly has to do with other companies like banks and so on, not so much Red Shell. Data processors must appoint data protection officers. These are people within the company who ensure compliance with GDPR. Now, I have a list of reading and YouTube links here on the internet. I'm going to put these in the description because these are not clickable links in the video, but I have them here as a backup in case you want to pause the video and take these down. These people are much more qualified than me to talk about these issues. A lot of these people are lawyers, privacy lawyers, corporate lawyers, and so on. And the top link there is the law itself. You can see that in the link it says legal content. So that's the actual GDPR that you can look up. And there are a few other websites that have it, and if that one doesn't work for you. And if you look down at the second to bottom link, that's the Federal Trade Commission. And it concerns a case with Facebook, not with Red Shell, where they require that Facebook comply to very similar principles to GDPR, that they can't actually engage in deceptive practices. And this is relevant to Red Shell because Red Shell, you could argue, did something very similar to what Facebook were accused of doing. And that case is ongoing, even though it's from 2012. And that's in the news. I mean, it's not really the subject of this video. So in any case, we'll get back to the specifics of Red Shell. So they also give you some tips about how to know if you have Red Shell on your computer. So in the Steam install folders, you have a Red Shell DLL or Red Shell SDK DLL in Steam install folders. These DLL files could be renamed to something else, though, so that it can't be found that way. Actually, out of curiosity, I don't remember if I checked that, so I will do that now. If this will let me do this. First of all, I have to switch windows here. There we go. Okay, so we'll look at Civilization 5, that's most likely culprit. And we look for the DLLs. We have a lot of readmes, but no Red Shell. That I can see anyway. So in the next part, I'll take a look at the end-user license agreement and a few more specifics of Red Shell and the issues surrounding it. Then I'll give my summary and conclusions.